Two stories are reshaping the cost of everyday life in Canada right now, and they're connected in ways most people haven't thought about. One is happening at the gas pump, the other is in a trade negotiation you've probably never heard of. And on April 29th, the Bank of Canada is going to have to look both of them in the face at once. Good evening and welcome to the Daily Brief Canadian Macro Weekend Edition. I'm Steve. With everything going on in the world, here are a few things that we at the Daily Brief think you should keep a lookout for this week. The ceasefire between the US and Iran collapsed in Pakistan today, and before the ink was even dried, Trump declared a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. That's the waterway that moves roughly 20% of the world's oil. At the same time, Canada's most important trade deal, the one that keeps everything from canola to car parts flowing tariff-free into the US, is heading into crunch time with a July 1st deadline that both sides now admit they'll likely miss. And on April 29th, the Bank of Canada makes its next rate call with a new monetary policy report right in the middle of all of it. Three stories, one thread. Here's what they might mean for your wallet. Gas was already elevated heading into this weekend. Canada's national average sits around $2.08 a litre right now, up from roughly $1.65 to $1.75 earlier this year. The Hormuz crisis being the main driver, with oil tankers stranded in the Persian Gulf and Brent crude hovering around $96 a barrel. Global supply has been choked for weeks. The ceasefire that was supposed to fix that just fell apart, meaning prices aren't coming down anytime soon. But here's something worth understanding. A big chunk of what you pay at the pump was never about oil to begin with. At the national average of $2.08 per litre, roughly 35 to 40% is government tax, and that tax bill looks very different depending on where you live. Vancouver is the most expensive city to fill up in Canada, sitting above $2.35 a litre. A big part of that is the TransLink Municipal Transit Levy, an extra 18.5 cents per litre that nobody in the rest of the country pays. Add BC's carbon regulation costs on top, and Vancouver drivers are carrying about 60 cents a litre in tax before they even start the car. Regina comes in at the other end around $1.62 a litre with lower provincial road taxes and no harmonized sales tax. Toronto and Calgary sit in the middle, both around $1.65 to $1.75, but for different reasons. Ontario dropped its provincial road tax to 9 cents per litre a few weeks ago. Alberta, on the other hand, has no provincial sales tax at all, which keeps pump prices structurally lower than anywhere else in the country. And here's the one that most people don't realize. The GST, that 5% federal sales tax, is calculated after every other tax is already included in the price. So you're paying federal sales tax on top of the provincial road tax, on top of the federal excise tax, on top of the carbon levies. A full 64-litre fill-up in Canada includes roughly $27 in total taxes on average. That number was already there before this year's oil spike. Now it's higher. Oil markets open tomorrow morning with Trump declaring a Hormuz naval blockade overnight after Iran talks collapse. Watch the open for the pump price to ripple this week. Most Canadians have heard about tariffs this year. Far fewer know what's actually protecting us from the worst of them. It's called CUSMA, the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, and it's the rule book for nearly everything that crosses the border. Right now it's in the middle of a mandatory review with a July 1st deadline. And last week, the U.S. Trade Representative said they won't hit that deadline. RBC Economist estimates that 89% of Canadian exports to the U.S. currently face zero tariffs. Why? Because they're compliant with the CUSMA's rules of origin. That's what's been keeping most Canadian products out of the worst of this trade war. Lose that protection and the average effective tariff on Canadian goods jumps from around 15% to over 20%. You'd feel that immediately in car prices, grocery costs, and construction materials. The sectors that are already not protected are the ones causing the most pain right now. Steel and aluminum face 50% tariffs under Section 232, no CUSMA exemption. Softwood lumber is at 10%, auto parts are partial, the U.S. content portions are exempt, but the rest isn't, which is why Ontario's auto corridor has been taking hits. The sectors that are still protected, and this is Canada's real leverage heading into negotiations, are energy and critical minerals. Canada exports nearly 4 million barrels of crude oil to the U.S. every single day, more than from any country in the world. With Hormuz effectively closed and the U.S. scrambling for supply, that leverage has never been bigger. Agriculture is also largely tariff-free. Grains, canola, beef, with dairy being the one sticking point the U.S. keeps pushing on. The bottom line, CUSMA is what's standing between Canadian exporters and a much more painful tariff environment. The review is underway. The deadline will be missed. What matters is whether the exemptions survive the negotiation. Something to watch this week as CUSMA negotiating teams are in Washington. The U.S. may formally trigger the exit clause as a negotiating tactic. Alarming sounding, but likely procedural. A 10-year clock would start, not an immediate collapse. Know the difference before your timeline fills up with talks about NAFTA 2.0 dying. bond markets have April 29th priced at about 94% hold when the Bank of Canada meets next week to discuss interest rates. The BOC has been sitting at 2.25% since October. That's 9 cuts from a peak of 5%, and by most readings, the cutting cycle is done. So no, the number itself probably isn't the story on the 29th. The story is the press conference and the new monetary policy report that comes with it, the bank's first full forecast update since January. Because Governor Macklem is going to have to publicly square something that doesn't square easily. He put it plainly himself at the March press conference. Economic weakness combined with rising inflation is a dilemma for central banks. Raising interest rates to slow inflation could further weaken the economy. Easing interest rates to support growth risks pushing inflation well above target. That's the bind. On one side, unemployment has risen to 6.7%. The economy shed 84,000 jobs in February and GDP contracted in the fourth quarter. That's the case for staying cautious about tightening. On the other side, the Hormuz crisis has pushed Brent crude above 95 US a barrel. Gas prices are spiking, and BMO economists project headline CPI could approach 3% when March numbers drop. That's the case for not cutting. The number to watch before the 29th is March CPI dropping Monday, April 20th, the first reading to fully capture the war's energy spike. But here's the thing. Raising interest rates doesn't fix an oil supply shock. Higher borrowing costs won't reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The BOC knows this. Macklem already said they'll look through the energy price spike as long as it doesn't spread into broader prices. So what you're actually watching for on April 20th isn't whether CPI is high. It probably will be. You're watching whether core inflation, the stuff that excludes energy, stays anchored near 2%. If it does, the bank holds its nerve and stays on pause. If core starts creeping up alongside energy, that's when the calculus changes. The cure for high oil prices is ultimately high oil prices. They kill demand, supply adjusts, and prices fall. A rate hike won't speed that up. It'll just make your mortgage more expensive while you wait. And here's the practical implication for Canadians right now. If you're renewing a mortgage this spring, fixed rates are already moving higher. Because the 5-year Government of Canada bond yield has climbed from around 2.8% in January to about 3.1% today. That's the bond market pricing in inflation risk, independent of whatever the Bank of Canada decides on the 29th. The bank doesn't need to raise its policy rate for fixed-rate mortgage costs to go up. They're already going up. These three stories are more connected than they look. The Hormuz crisis keeps global oil prices elevated. That's inflationary pressure Canada can't fully control, and it lands directly on every Canadian wallet at the pump. CUSMA is one place where Canada does have agency, and with energy as its biggest bargaining chip, and that chip now more valuable than ever, the negotiating position is stronger than the headlines suggest. And the Bank of Canada is sitting in the middle of it all, trying to calibrate monetary policy for an economy that's simultaneously too weak to tighten and facing an inflation risk it can't ignore. April 29th is almost certainly a hold, but the language around it will matter, and core March CPI on the 20th is the number that sets that language up. Well, that's all for the Daily Brief Weekend Edition. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's brief, and don't be afraid to comment if there's another creator you think deserves a highlight here. I'm Steve. As always, nothing here is financial advice. Everyone's situation is different, so please do your own research and talk to a qualified financial advisor before making any investment decisions. Good night.